Welcome to our fourth lesson for Period 5. Today we're going to be talking about nationalism. What it is, where it comes from, what causes it, and its effects. Four things. First, our definition of nationalism. Nationalism is the creation of identity, a united one that people can agree and say they are part of. Now, this is a very broad definition because there's many different versions and types of nationalism. But the easiest way to think about it, we connect it to the idea of patriotism, is that you share a same identity with everyone else who lives in your area. Some examples we gave is like sports nationalism, Chiefs Kingdom or Chiefs Nation, where you're a fan, you identify with a sports team and everyone's connected through that. Same thing here. Usually, nations are a group of people who thus have that same identity. This is where definitions can be confusing. States or countries are not always nations because sometimes there's many different nations within a country. But the whole big point of Period 5 is that we have the emergence of these nation states, of countries and states that also have a national identity that their people buy into and agree upon. Cool, so what makes up nationalism? There's a lot of different parts or pieces that make up nationalism or create a national identity. So what makes up nationalism, or what makes up a national identity? There's four main parts. Geography or location, history, there's usually some sort of myth or creation of thing that people have gone through together. Culture, with anything from language to faith, to food, to there's a whole bunch of things that make up someone's personal cultural identity. And lastly, there is shared struggle. Usually a group of people have gone through some sort of conflict or something that has forged their identity. So with those things in mind, this creates those four components. Those four components create identity. And as people buy into an identity becomes larger, these people often want to create their own state. People want to form countries of people that they share an identity with and can thus have this nationalism and can then have that nationalism and that belief in this united identity that they want to support and fight for. That's why nationalism is often considered an ideology or a set of beliefs. A good example is American nationalism, this belief in American identity and greatness that often comes from like some core ideas that what American means to be. Everything from freedom, liberty, human rights. A part of American national identity has at times been multiculturalism. And all of this put together creates a national identity. And every single country's national identity has different components. Cool, so we're going to pause here and you're going to answer that first question over what is nationalism. So hypothetically, you have answered that question of nationalism. We're going to move on to our next part, context. So what was it like before we had this creation of united identity? Cool, so what did people identify with before nationalism, before this creation of an identity that people bought into? There are three main things that people used to consider their identity. And it explains why you often have these huge empires made up of many, 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 many different people. First is religion. Someone might identify with a united faith. Our examples are Catholicism in feudal Europe, Islam throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and West Asia, Hinduism in India, Confucianism in China, things like that. Faith was often a good way, an easy way for people to have a connection with those who they often never saw or saw very, very rarely. And so there were times throughout history that one's religious identity was more important than being loyal to a country or an empire. Another is locality. For most of human history, where you were born is where you stayed. You never traveled. You never left. Very few people actually got to leave the area they were born in. And usually if you left, it was either for war. And usually if you left, it was for war, in which there's a good chance you weren't coming back. So your locality mattered more than anything else. You were a person of this village or this town. You knew those people, and those are the people you trusted because you saw and lived with every single day. Another example of locality can also be a tribe or ethnicity. And so basically who you were most like, who you saw the most, is who you would trust and identify with. Next, we have, last but not least, we have leader. This is often because empires or states or countries were formed by a king or a strong emperor, and their dynasty or those that were related to that person ruled. And so people would often have this connection to, or this belief in this singular ruler and this ruler's dynasty as people that they could identify with, trust, and follow. So those were the things that people used to identify with or create identity around. And what this led to was that you had many empires that spanned many, many groups of people. The reason that could work, though, is that there wasn't strong national bonds that tied a lot of people together that would make them then resist. Instead, as long as people's locality was respected, they'd be fine. Or if their faith was respected, they'd be fine. Or if they might even identify more with the conquering leader than the people who used to rule them. And so it was easier for people who had a large differences live in an empire together, because what you identified with wasn't as big of a deal, or was a lot easier to manage. Cool, so we're going to pause here and you're going to answer a question about the context or what identity was based around before nationalism. Go ahead and go. Hypothetically, you've answered question 2, and now we're going to go into what causes nationalism to start. Nationalism, you could consider, have been in a lot of places, but there is there's a time we could say nationalism truly started to happen and then spread. Specifically, it was because of the Atlantic revolutions, which means it's part Atlantic Revolution and part Enlightenment. The Enlightenment part of it is now we have this belief that people are equal, and if you believe everyone around you is equal, you're most likely to develop bonds of trust with everyone around you. Instead, I trust everyone because we are human. We are people together. Instead of maybe like, I only trust people who are farmers, or I only trust people who are poor or rich, things like that. But the Atlantic Revolutions did a unique thing. The Atlantic Revolutions had people who now formed into larger identities say, we are X people resisting this group. Let's look at the North American Revolution. The colonists called themselves Americans and said, as Americans, we deserve to be ruled by other Americans and not listen to the British and the British king. In France, people started to say, we are French people, and this king does not support the French people. The third estate is France. And so what happens is that in all these Atlantic revolutions, you have people who are now forming identities of unity to resist either colonial overlords like the British or the Spanish, or as a reason to overthrow those who don't represent them, such as the Haitians creating a Haitian identity against the French white planters, or the lower class of France saying the rich and the upper class do not actually represent them. Let's use the French Revolution as a really good case study, and we could also consider the French Revolution as one of the most important creators of nationalism in Europe itself, and Europe is going to export this idea of nationalism. So, in the French Revolution, nationalism was created within France. Because of this revolution that considered all people equal, all men were in unity to create this government and this society. What this French Revolution did was encourage French people to feel French. We are all together in this government. We are all together in this revolution. And we need to support each other. Not only that, during the French Revolution, most European countries declared war on France because they overthrew their king. And other European countries were scared of them. This led the French people to have this shared struggle. They went, the whole of Europe is against us. We need to unite together. Almost every French male had a war responsibility, whether it was fighting or supporting the war effort. Women were supposed to take part in knitting clothes for soldiers. Children were supposed to collect and take on farm work. Children were also supposed to help in weaving or in farm work. Everyone was dedicated to this war effort. And this united war effort created this identity as French. As French people, we need to fight for our country, defend our rights, and make sure we continue protecting this country that we love. So this French identity, this nationalism, was created through revolution and through war. Not only that, the French Revolution exported nationalism. As Napoleon led the French Revolution and conquered a lot of Europe, as Napoleon and the French people conquered most of Europe, they, in a way, caused nationalism across Europe. They spread Enlightenment ideas, which created this idea of equality and unity. And they also created shared struggle. As groups of people united to resist the French, they started to form their own national identities. People in the Holy Roman Empire started to feel German. People in Eastern Europe began to feel Polish. People in Spain began to feel Spanish. Like there was this united agreement as people started to fight the French Revolution. They started to form their own identity and nationalist bonds. So this resistance to this taking over the this resistance to the French Empire was another reason why nationalist identities began to form and nationalism began to spread. Once again, connected this idea of the Enlightenment as if we are all equal people, we thus have a lot in common and can unite together. Finally, another reason that nationalism spread that isn't quite on here, but I want to make sure we get, is the changing society that we see within Europe. We're going to talk about this when we get to industrialization, but more and more people move to cities. As people move to cities, they're all the separate localities began to mix into one identity. As people mixed into one identity, one language began to be used. People started to be able to read more, and so literature was able to be shared, and a shared culture began to form. So let me say that again. As people began to move to cities, this breakdown of local culture started to happen as people started to unite around larger cultural identities within cities that then spread outside of cities. And not only that, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment started to break down people's belief and identification in religion and the ruler. So once again, helping create this united identity that then spread out throughout the area. Cool, I'm going to pause here and you're going to answer that question about what caused nationalism. Go ahead and go. Cool, so hypothetically we've answered question 3, and now we're going to do our last part, the effects of nationalism. There's 2 main effects of nationalism. First, we have the creation of nation states. This is going to start in Europe, but then in the late 1800s, very end of 1800s, and then throughout the 1900s, this is going to happen throughout the rest of the world as well. But basically what happens in Europe is that people start to more and more form nation states, or countries that represent a specific national identity and create this unity behind this identity. As we said, it starts in France, but countries either have to develop one or they kind of fall apart. The English, for example, created their own English identity, and those they ruled, the Scottish and the Irish, also created their own identities in resistance to the British. The Germans are going to create a nation state out of a German identity. Austrians, Italians, Spanish, things like that. This is when people actually start to refer to themselves as these things, as French, as Spanish, things like that. Now what happens is that as nation states form, rebellions and empires start to increase. As we said, period 4, the gunpowder empires, the big empires of Europe, all ruled over many, many different people. And as these people began to form national identities, they wanted governments and states that represented them. We haven't talked about this empire very much, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a huge empire in Central and Eastern Europe, began to fall apart as all these rebellions occurred of people who wanted to form their own countries. The Ottoman Empire faces the same issue as the Greeks start to rebel, and so do Arab people who view themselves not as Turkish and thus want their own countries that represent Arabs, not Turkish people. This is going to be an issue throughout the rest of the 1800s and 1900s as people resist being part of multicultural empires and instead want to form countries that represent them. I'm going to stop here and you're going to answer that 4th question over nationalism. Go ahead and go.